On a quiet Sunday morning in Fairview, Alabama, the congregation at St. Mark's Baptist Church gathered for what seemed like a normal service. The air hummed with soft whispers, the rustle of hymnals, the creak of wooden pews beneath the weight of devoted souls. Then a woman stepped forward. She was meant to share a message of faith. Instead, she brought something else, something heavier, a truth long buried beneath the very foundation of this church. As her voice trembled through the microphone, the atmosphere shifted. The warmth of fellowship turned to an unbearable silence. Eyes widened. Hands tightened around prayer books. In the back row, someone gasped. For years, a secret had festered beneath these sacred walls, protected by the very man the community trusted most. How did a pastor, respected, beloved, keep such a dark secret hidden in plain sight? And why did it take this one moment for the truth to finally come out? St. Mark's Baptist Church stood at the heart of Fairview, Alabama, a town where Sundays were sacred, where families filled the narrow streets in their best clothes, and where faith was more than belief. It was the foundation of the community. The church itself was a modest building, white painted wood with tall stained glass windows that cast colorful patterns across the worn pews. Its steeple, though weathered by time, pointed toward the heavens, a symbol of the unshakable trust placed in the man who led its congregation. For over 20 years, that man was Pastor Kevin Robertson. At 62, he was a fixture in the town, his deep voice carrying the weight of authority, his words laced with conviction. His sermons were passionate, his presence commanding. To those who knew him, he was more than a pastor. He was a shepherd guiding his flock, a father to the fatherless, a counselor to the troubled. He had a wife, Linda, who played piano during service, and 2 grown sons who had long moved away. To his congregation, he was a family man, a man of unwavering devotion, of discipline, of faith. He spoke of righteousness, of duty, of the path toward salvation. His sermons could bring a packed church to silence, heads bowed, hands clasped in prayer. But Pastor Kevin was also a man who controlled the space around him. Nothing happened in St. Mark's without his approval. Decisions were his to make, questions his to answer. His authority was rarely challenged, and if it was, the dissenting voice often disappeared quietly. And then there was Rebecca Holloway. She had been just 16 when she first walked through the doors of St. Mark's with her mother, drawn in by the promise of community. A bright girl, eager to belong, eager to listen. The church took her in, welcomed her as one of their own. It wasn't long before she became a familiar sight, helping with Sunday school, volunteering at charity events, standing in the choir with eyes closed as she sang. By the time she was 18, Rebecca had become one of the church's most promising young speakers. She was eloquent, passionate, with a voice that carried through the sanctuary with the same conviction as the pastor himself. She spoke of faith, of kindness, of trust in the Lord. The congregation admired her. They listened when she spoke, nodded in agreement, felt inspired by her words, and Pastor Kevin had noticed. He had taken her under his wing, offering guidance, mentorship. He told her she had a gift, that her voice could change lives. He encouraged her, praised her, gave her responsibilities within the church. He made her feel important. She was young, full of admiration for the man she believed to be a great leader. And then the meetings began. First, it was after Sunday service, brief conversations in his office, where he would speak to her about faith, about the responsibilities of leadership. Then it was longer discussions, private ones, away from the congregation. He told her she was special, that she had been chosen by God to do great things. No one questioned it. Why would they? She was a bright young woman, eager to serve the church. He was a pastor, a man of God, a mentor. The community saw nothing unusual, but Rebecca knew. She knew the moment his hand lingered on her shoulder longer than necessary. She knew when the conversations became less about her faith and more about her devotion to him. And by the time she understood what was happening, it was too late. For years, the truth remained locked away, behind closed doors, beneath quiet smiles, hidden within the walls of St. Mark's Baptist Church, until the day she stepped onto the stage and spoke. It began with trust. Rebecca Holloway had always trusted Pastor Kevin Robertson. She had trusted his words when he spoke of faith, trusted his guidance when he encouraged her to grow within the church. In the beginning, His presence felt like protection, an anchor in the ever-changing tides of young adulthood. He was a man of wisdom, a man of God, and when he told her that she had been chosen for something greater, she believed him. It started simply enough. A moment after Sunday service, when the congregation had begun to disperse, and he called her aside. His voice was warm, reassuring. He spoke of her potential, of the way her words carried weight when she addressed the congregation. "You have a gift, Rebecca," he had said. "God has placed something special in you. I see it. I feel it." There was nothing unusual about his words, not at first, not when he praised her for her dedication to the church, not when he asked if she needed guidance, not when he offered to mentor her personally. She had looked up to him, admired him, as so many in the congregation did. So when he suggested they meet outside of Sunday service, she saw no reason to refuse. At first, their conversations remained within the walls of St. Mark's. He would invite her to his office, a modest room tucked behind the sanctuary, where an old wooden desk stood beneath shelves lined with theological texts. The meetings were structured, purposeful. He spoke of leadership, of how a person of faith must carry themselves in the world. He encouraged her to share her thoughts, her doubts, her fears, and she did. She confided in him about the weight of expectations, about the pressure she felt to always be good, to always be strong. She told him about her struggles, about how she sometimes felt lost, and each time she spoke, patiently, kindly. "You don't have to carry this alone," he had said once, reaching across the desk to take her hand. "I'm here for you, always." She remembered the way her breath had caught in her throat, the way her skin prickled beneath his touch. She had thought, just for a moment, that it lingered too long, but she had pushed the thought aside. He was her pastor. There was nothing wrong with a comforting touch, nothing wrong when he began texting her outside of church. At first, it was scripture, passages meant to inspire, to encourage. He sent her verses about strength, about wisdom, about faith. Then the messages became more personal. "How are you feeling today? You seem troubled this morning. Is something on your mind? I see how hard you work. Don't let the weight of expectations crush you." Rebecca had felt seen in those words, understood. When he spoke, she felt special, and when he told her that God had brought her into his life for a reason, she believed him. The meetings changed. He began inviting her to places outside the church, small cafes on the outskirts of town, where the congregation was unlikely to see them. He would sit across from her, hands folded, voice steady. "I want to help you become the leader you were meant to be," he told her once, the steam from his coffee curling between them. She had nodded, eager, grateful. And then his words shifted. He told her that leadership required trust, that she needed to let go of doubt, of fear, of hesitation. He spoke of sacrifice, of submission to God's plan. He told her that not everyone would understand what he asks of us, that faith is sometimes tested in ways we do not expect. Rebecca had listened, hands wrapped around her mug, the warmth pressing into her palms. She had nodded again. She wanted to understand. She wanted to be worthy. And when he reached across the table, taking her hands in his grip firm, she did not pull away. The phone calls followed. Late at night, after the lights in her mother's house had gone dark, her phone would buzz softly against the nightstand. "Are you awake?" she would answer. His voice was low, calm, familiar. He spoke of her voice, her presence, the light within her. He told her she had changed him, that she was different from anyone else. And Rebecca, young and uncertain, wanted to believe it. The first time he told her that he needed her, she had felt her chest tighten. She did not understand why. The first time he told her that God had placed them in each other's lives for a reason, she had felt something stir inside her, a hesitation, a flicker of doubt. But he spoke with conviction, and so she ignored it. At church, nothing seemed amiss. The congregation still revered him, still hung on to his every word. No one questioned their closeness. She was his student, after all. She was learning. When he began calling her into his office after hours, no one thought to ask why. When he began meeting her outside of town, no one noticed. No one saw the red flags, or if they did, they said nothing. For months, Rebecca did not say anything either. She told herself that there was nothing wrong, that he was only guiding her, that his words meant nothing more than what they were. But then, there were the moments she could not explain. The way he stood too close when they spoke in private. The way his hand pressed against the small of her back when he guided her through a door. The way his gaze lingered, longer than necessary. The way he told her, in quiet moments, that God works in ways we do not always understand. And the first time he told her that she was special, chosen, meant for him, she did not respond. She had only stared at him, the air thick between them. And she had wondered, for the first time, if this was what faith was supposed to feel like. It was Sunday, October 8, 2017, as families dressed in their finest made their way to St. Mark's Baptist Church. It was a ritual as familiar as the rising of the sun. The doors stood open, welcoming all who sought comfort, guidance, and the Word of God. Inside, the congregation settled into their seats, their voices merging into a soft murmur beneath the towering wooden beams. The scent of old hymnals, fresh coffee from the fellowship hall, and faint traces of perfume drifted through the air. The choir stood at the front, their robes pressed, their hands clasped, waiting for the service to begin. There was an expectation, a rhythm to the morning, a prayer, a hymn, a sermon from the man who had stood at the pulpit for over 2 decades. But today, something was different. Rebecca Holloway stood at the front of the church. The congregation watched as she walked up the steps, her movements slow, deliberate. She had spoken here before many times, her voice carrying messages of hope and faith. But today there was hesitation in her steps, a weight in her shoulders. A hush settled over the room. She reached the pulpit, her fingers grazing the worn wooden edge, the microphone humming softly before her. Her hands trembled. She took a breath, and then she spoke. For years I have been carrying a burden, and I can't stay silent anymore. A ripple ran through the crowd. People shifted in their seats, glancing at one another, confused. At the front row, Pastor Kevin Robertson sat still, his expression unreadable, his hands folded neatly in his lap. His wife, Linda, beside him, turned her head ever so slightly. Rebecca swallowed, her gaze lifting, scanning the faces of those she had known for most of her life. They trusted her, and that was why she had to tell them the truth. Her voice was unsteady at first, low, forcing the congregation to lean in, to listen closely. She spoke of her faith, how the church had been her home since she was a teenager, how she had believed in the man who led it. And then she told them what had happened. She had been 18 years old when the pastor had taken her under his wing, when the text messages had started, when the private meetings had begun. She described how, at first, she had thought it was mentorship, that he had seen potential in her, how he had convinced her that she had been chosen for something greater. The congregation sat frozen. Some leaned forward, gripping the edges of their seats. Others exchanged whispers, barely audible in the growing tension of the room. Rebecca's voice did not waver now. She spoke of the promises he had made, that she was special, that God had placed them in each other's lives for a reason. She spoke of the long nights of doubt, of how he had twisted scripture to justify what he was doing. She had been young, trusting, eager to serve, and he had used that trust against her. A gasp rang out from somewhere in the back. A murmur spread through the room like a slow-moving wave. Eyes flickered toward Pastor Kevin, who sat motionless, his fingers now gripping the armrest of his chair. Linda Kevin's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Rebecca pressed on. She spoke of the guilt, the fear, how she had stayed silent for so long because she had been afraid no one would believe her. And she saw it now, the disbelief in some faces, the furrowed brows, the uncertainty. But she also saw recognition. She saw the way some of the women in the congregation clenched their jaws, how their eyes darted downward as if recalling something from their own past. She saw doubt, and then she saw anger. The murmurs grew louder. Someone whispered, "No, it can't be." Another voice, sharper, angrier, asked, "Is this true?" Rebecca turned then, facing the man who had once been her pastor, her mentor. "You told me I was the only one." It was a sentence that hung in the air, an accusation wrapped in quiet devastation. For the first time, Pastor Kevin moved. His face remained carefully composed, but his posture betrayed him. His fingers tightening against the chair, his throat shifting as he swallowed. He did not speak, but the silence spoke for him. From the side, a woman stood abruptly, her pew creaking beneath her. How many others? A single question, sharp, demanding. And Rebecca understood in that moment that she was not alone. More voices rose, some in disbelief, others in rage. The unity of the congregation fractured, splintered into whispered accusations, gasps of horror, and still the pastor said nothing. A man who had built his life on words, on sermons that moved people to tears, now sat in silence as his own sins were laid bare. A woman near the front, one of the deacon's wives, turned to Linda Kevin. "Did you know?" Linda, pale, rigid, blinked but did not answer. Another voice, "Someone call the police." Pastor Kevin finally stood, his movement slow, deliberate. He turned to face his congregation, the people who had once trusted him without question. And for the first time in decades, the weight of that trust began to crumble. Rebecca stood at the pulpit, her hands still trembling. But her voice was steady. She had spoken the truth, and now there was no turning back. The silence did not last long. The moment Rebecca Holloway stepped down from the pulpit, the voices began. At first it was only whispers, soft, uncertain, the kind exchanged behind hands and between glances. But then the whispers grew, into murmurs, into disbelief, into something that rippled through the congregation like a current shifting beneath the surface of a once calm river. Some sat frozen, their expressions unreadable, their minds struggling to reconcile the man they had followed for decades with the accusations that had just been spoken aloud. Others shook their heads, refusing to accept it. But there were those who had known, in some way, for a long time. A woman in the third row gripped the edge of her pew, her knuckles white. Her breath was shallow, her eyes fixed on Rebecca as if seeing something she had long tried to forget. Another woman, seated near the back, pressed a trembling hand against her lips, and then someone stood. A voice, strong, unwavering, cut through the noise. "She's not lying." Heads turned, eyes widened. It was Angela Davis, a woman who had attended St. Mark's since she was a child, now in her 40s, a mother herself. She took a slow breath, and then she spoke again. "It happened to me, too." A collective gasp swept through the sanctuary. Another voice followed, soft, hesitant. "And to me." The weight of their words settled into the room, pressing into every wooden pew, into every quiet breath. It was not just Rebecca, and now there was no stopping it. More voices rose, some in agreement, others in outrage. From the left side of the room, a man stood abruptly, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists. Deacon James Holloway, Rebecca's uncle. His voice was sharp, demanding. "How long has this been going on?" No answer came, because the one person who should have answered, the man who had stood at the pulpit for over 20 years, guiding these very people, was gone. At some point in the growing chaos, Pastor Kevin Robertson had slipped out of his seat, moved through the side door, and disappeared. Gone without a word. The news spread fast. By the next morning, the story had reached beyond the walls of St. Mark's Baptist Church. Phone calls were made. Conversations took place in hushed tones across kitchen tables, in grocery store aisles, outside of school pickup lines. For years, he had been untouchable, a pillar of the community, a man respected and trusted. But now, that trust was broken, and with it, the image of the man they thought they knew. Some refused to believe it. To them, Pastor Kevin was a good man, a man who had led their children's baptisms, who had presided over weddings, who had comforted grieving families. Some called Rebecca a liar, a troublemaker, a girl seeking attention. Some defended him, said that there had to be a misunderstanding, that she had misinterpreted his kindness, that she had twisted something pure into something ugly. But others knew better, because it was not just Rebecca anymore. By the end of the week, 4 more women had come forward, 4 more stories, each one fearfully similar, each one filled with promises made in secrecy, justifications wrapped in scripture, trust turned against them. The accusations could no longer be ignored. A formal investigation was launched. Authorities searched for Kevin, but he was nowhere to be found. His home was empty, his belongings untouched. His car remained in the driveway, the keys still inside. There was no farewell sermon, no final words, no attempt to defend himself. Just an empty office, an abandoned pulpit, and the weight of silence where his voice had once been. For Rebecca, the days that followed were not easy. She had told the truth, but telling the truth did not erase the years of whispers behind closed doors, of moments she could never take back. Some turned their backs on her. Some refused to meet her eyes in the grocery store, walked past her without a word, but others stood beside her, Her family, the women who had spoken after her. The few members of the congregation who knew that silence had been the real enemy all along. She filed a formal complaint with police. A case was opened. A warrant was issued. But without a suspect, there was no arrest to be made. And Kevin Robertson remained missing. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. Rumors swirled. Some claimed to have seen him in another state, in a small church under a different name. Others believed he had fled the country altogether, but one thing was certain. He never returned to Fairview. As for St. Mark's Baptist Church, the aftermath was unavoidable. Attendance dwindled. Trust had been shattered. Families who had once filled the pews on Sundays now stayed home. For months, the pulpit remained empty. Eventually, a new pastor was appointed, a younger man with no ties to the past, one who carried the difficult task of rebuilding what had been lost. Some believed the church would never recover, because faith, once broken, is not so easily restored. And for those who had once looked to their pastor for guidance, only to see him vanish like a shadow in the night, the questions remained. Had they ever truly known him? Or had they only known the man he had wanted them to see? For Rebecca, life moved forward. She left Fairview. She pursued justice, even when justice felt impossible. She told her story again and again, so that no one else would have to wonder if their voice would ever be heard. And though the past could never be erased, she carried with her the one thing that Kevin had never been able to take. Her truth, spoken, unwavering, for all to hear. For months, Kevin was nowhere to be found. In the days after his quiet escape from St. Mark's Baptist Church, he left behind an abandoned home, a congregation in turmoil, and a growing investigation that stretched beyond the walls of Fairview, Alabama. His sudden disappearance had only deepened the divide within the community. For some, it was proof of his guilt. A man with nothing to hide would have stayed to answer the accusations. For others, it was a sign of injustice, a respected pastor forced into exile by what they called false claims. But the law did not see it that way, and neither did the victims. The case against Kevin grew stronger with each passing week. By December 2017, 7 women had come forward, detailing the same pattern of manipulation and abuse that had begun years earlier. Text messages, emails, handwritten notes, all pointing to a man who had used his position not to guide, but to control. Law enforcement issued an arrest warrant. His name was entered into national databases. His image was circulated across police departments. But still, there was no trace of him. For a while, it seemed that he had simply disappeared, swallowed up by the vastness of the world beyond Fairview. Until one evening, in the summer of 2018, nearly a year after his escape, a call came in to the U.S. Marshal Service. A man matching Kevin's description had been spotted hundreds of miles away. The location? A small church in Jackson, Mississippi. Kevin had lived under a new name, a new identity. In Jackson, he had reinvented himself, presenting himself as a man of faith who had simply come to town to seek a fresh start, a different congregation, a different pulpit. And yet, his methods had not changed. He had settled into a small, independent church, one without ties to larger denominations, where oversight was minimal and questions were scarce. He had not taken the title of pastor, not officially, but he had begun to advise, to guide, to hold small Bible study groups. Slowly, he built trust again. And once again, he had gained access to those who looked to him for spiritual leadership. But someone had recognized him. A former member of St. Mark's, now living in Jackson, had seen his face in a church gathering. The name was different, but the voice, the mannerisms, the way he spoke, it was him. And this time, there was no escape. On August 14, 2018, federal agents, alongside local authorities, moved in. Kevin was arrested just outside the church where he had been leading a private discussion group. Handcuffed, silent, he offered no resistance. There was no speech, no plea, no attempt to justify. Only the reality of a man who had run out of places to hide. He was extradited to Alabama, where he was finally brought before a courtroom that had waited nearly a year for his return. And this time, there would be no pulpit to shield him. The trial of Kevin began in February 2019. Inside the Jefferson County Courthouse, the seats were filled with reporters, former church members, victims, and community leaders. Some had come to see justice. Others had come to see if the man they once trusted would finally tell the truth. Rebecca Holloway was there. So were the 6 other women who had come forward. Their testimonies were painstaking, detailed, undeniable. They spoke of his words, his manipulation, the fear that had kept them silent for so long. Evidence was presented. Phone records, emails, journal entries written by Rebecca dating back years. A pattern emerged, one that spanned over 2 decades, crossing state lines, involving women from different periods of his time as a pastor. The defense argued that the relationships had been consensual, but the prosecution pointed to the power dynamic, to the way he had used his role to groom and manipulate his victims, exploiting their faith and trust. Witness after witness told the same story. A trusted leader, a man who saw opportunity in devotion, a man who used his position not to protect, but to control. On April 3, 2019, after nearly 2 months of proceedings, the jury reached a verdict. The courtroom sat in unsettling silence as the foreman stood to read the decision. Guilty, on all counts. Charges included sexual abuse, exploitation, obstruction of justice, and fraudulent financial activities related to church funds used to cover his movements during his time on the run. He was sentenced to 38 years in federal prison. There would be no appeal, no second chance at reinvention. Kevin was escorted out of the courtroom in shackles, his once loyal supporters silent, their faith in him shattered beyond repair. For the first time in decades, he would no longer stand before a congregation. He would no longer speak from a pulpit, guiding those who once trusted him. Instead, he would spend his remaining years behind the walls of a prison cell, no longer a shepherd, but simply another man who had abused his power and faced the consequences of his actions. For Rebecca Holloway, it was a long road to justice. She had stood before a church and spoken the truth when no one else would. And now she could finally step away from the past. The weight of doubt, fear, and silence gone. She had faced the man who had stolen years from her life, and she had won. But perhaps more importantly, she had been believed. Rebecca Holloway's story ended in Fairview, Alabama. But stories like hers do not stop at town lines. They do not begin and end within the walls of a single church. Because in communities across the country, small towns, big cities, places where faith is the foundation of daily life, there are other names, other voices, other truths waiting to be spoken. For every pastor, every minister, every trusted leader who has abused their power, there is a congregation that has looked the other way. A community that has chosen silence over confrontation. A town where the truth has been whispered but never spoken aloud. How many other churches are hiding similar secrets? How many other pastors have stood at their pulpits on Sunday morning, preaching about morality, about righteousness, while carrying their own unspeakable sins behind closed doors? How many victims have sat quietly in the same pews where they were once told to trust, to believe, to obey? These are not isolated cases. They are part of a pattern woven into the very structure of trust that allows powerful men to go unchecked. Some of them will never be caught. Some will resign quietly, moving to a different church in another town where no one knows their past. Some will be protected, shielded by those who refuse to believe the accusations, who see the man behind the pulpit before they see the victims before them. And some, like Kevin Robertson, will simply disappear, leaving behind broken communities and unanswered questions. But what about those left behind? For the victims, speaking out does not erase what has been done. It does not undo the years of silence, the weight of being told they were alone, that no one would believe them. For many, it is only the beginning of another battle, a battle against those who refuse to listen, who cast doubt, who demand proof for something that cannot always be measured in evidence alone. And yet, they still come forward. They tell their stories, knowing that truth alone is often not enough to bring justice. But they speak anyway. Because for every Rebecca Holloway, for every woman who steps forward despite the risks, despite the backlash, there is another who is still waiting for the right moment, still wondering if she will ever be heard, still asking herself the same question: will they believe me? And so the question turns to you. If this had happened in your town, in your church, to someone you knew, would you have believed them? Would you have stood by their side? Or would you have looked away, telling yourself it could not possibly be true? Would you have demanded answers? Or would you have sat in silence, waiting for someone else to speak first? Because stories like Rebecca's do not stay confined to news reports or courtroom testimonies. They unfold in real time, in the places you least expect, in the voices you never thought you would hear. The question is not if it will happen again. The question is, what will you do when it does? For those who have watched, listened, and stayed until the very end of this story, the conversation does not end here. It begins now. If this happened in your community, what would you do? Would you believe? Would you listen? Would you speak? Kindly subscribe, leave a comment, share your thoughts, because silence is what allows stories like these to continue. And perhaps, just perhaps, someone, somewhere, is waiting for a sign that they too can finally tell their story.